Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages. This is episode 22 of the show about the show. I am the creator and host of this podcast. My name, as always, is Devlin Clark. I have a very special guest coming on today. I have Denver Post columnist and Rockies writer Nick Groke coming on. We are going to talk about all things Colorado Rockies baseball. We are going to talk about them re-signing Carlos Gomez, that super bullpen, and if anybody will be able to catch the LA Dodgers. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Nick Groke. Nick, how you doing?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hey, thanks for giving me some of your time today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Yeah.
All right, let's jump right in. So the Rockies are 8-10 coming into today's play in spring training. What's kind of the buzz around the team as to the projection with how they're going to do this year?
I mean, it's tough to say because they're in the best division probably in baseball. But on paper, at least, it's essentially the same team as last year, but slightly improved. Their bullpen is probably better than it was last year, and bullpen was a strength of theirs last year. As far as the lineup and the rotation, first of all, though, is essentially the same minus Tyler Chatwood, who went to the Cubs. But all of their young pitchers are back and presumably improved. Four of them were rookies last year. So they were certainly tested under fire, and they'll have that experience to work off of this season. The lineup is really the question. They don't hit a lot of home runs. That was an issue last year. It's one reason they brought back Carlos Gonzalez over the weekend, signing him to a one-year deal. The questions are offensively. They led the league in runs last year, but that's a Coors Field product. They probably need to improve offensively, especially on the road when they play in pitchers' parks like San Diego and LA and San Francisco. It'll be a tough division. That's really the wild card as far as projections for the Rockies. But when you look at the NL picture, there are definitely a handful of teams that seem like they will be competing for wild card spots, and I would imagine between the Brewers, the Diamondbacks, the Rockies, maybe the Giants, maybe the Phillies, and the Cardinals, a few others, the wild card could get pretty dicey at the end of the season.
Makes for some good TV. So you touched on it, Carlos Gonzalez re-signed. He's been in Colorado now for 10 years. He signed a one-year, $5 million deal. Talk about what this offseason's been like, not only for hitters like him, but just kind of baseball in general. I'm a Twins fan, and we've been able to kind of reap some of the benefits of the, I would say, maybe bargain free agent market. But talk about a guy of his caliber, you would think would have gotten more than $5 million on the free agent market.
His was a 1 year and 8, but he was looking for something more like 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean he was definitely a product of whatever of the market falling out of free agency this winter. He was not alone, like you said. The curious thing to me was that after a while, I assumed that teams would start pouncing on a value market because after a while, it seems prices would come way down, and that's kind of what happened with Mike Moustakas in Kansas City and a little bit with Carlos Gonzalez in Colorado, but Jonathan Lucroy too in Oakland. His market kind of fell out, but I thought at one point that there might be a flurry of activity for the remaining free agents, and there were a lot of them. And it happened a little bit, but it didn't totally correct in the way that I maybe was guessing. It was a strange offseason. It'll be really curious to see if it extends to next season when the real free agency bonanza happens, with namely with Bryce Harper at the top. But it's a curious thing, and the players are definitely in tune with this. They're curious and probably worried, I think, kind of across baseball.
Absolutely. You touched on it. A few minutes ago. Let's kind of dive into the bullpen. So the bullpen, I think for everybody, the Rockies kind of made the big splashes early in the off season, almost right after the World Series ended, signing Wade Davis and Brian Shaw. Brian Shaw has been an important cog in the Indians bullpen for the last couple seasons, and Wade Davis, obviously, with the Royals and the Cubs previously. And then they bring back Jake McGee, who they'd acquired from Tampa Bay January of 2016. It only cost them $106 million to do that. There's got to be some pretty high expectations that they're gonna close the door on games.
Oh yeah, no, the Rockies identified pretty early on that they wanted to improve their bullpen. It worked for them last year, so they kind of re-raised this off season. They did it quickly because they knew exactly what they wanted and what they were willing to pay. And generally speaking, they got, it was a fair price. It was probably a fair price for who they got, but also the Rockies aren't completely committed. I mean, 3 years for these pitchers is certainly not a long-term commitment. They certainly spent money. It's not something that would cripple them probably in the long run, and they, spending on a bullpen, especially in the short term, can reap pretty immediate benefits. I think that's kind of essentially what they were looking at with this bullpen. It helps so much to have a reliable bullpen last season behind their young rotation, and as long as this rotation remains young, the Rockies, I think, see real value in having a more experienced and more shut down back end of their bullpen, which seems like a pretty intelligent plan all in all. Even at Coors Field, where games can get nutty and you have to sacrifice one game for the sake of a long homestand because you're going to have to burn your bullpen, stuff like this. I mean, they deal with unique issues, and the better their bullpen can be, it gives them a lot more versatility and leverage pitching at Coors Field. I think that's kind of what they were going for with their bullpen, and they can point to results from last season as being evidence of why that might work.
Yeah, and you talked about the guys in the bullpen last year, specifically Jake McGee. You mentioned the home and road splits, how the Rockies tend to not hit the ball very well on the road or pitch very well on the road. Jake McGee last year had a 4.73 ERA at Coors Field and a 2.64 mark on the road. But he decided to re-sign nonetheless. In a situation like that, that's a 2-run difference. What's going on? Is it just the altitude at Coors Field, or was it something else last year with the Rockies?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny when you mentioned that his home number, and you kind of allude to it being large. To me, that's a pretty good ERA for Coors Field, to be honest. And the problem though is not like pitching at Coors Field and then pitching on the road. It's what happens when you go from one to the other. Pitchers are often find difficulty not just at Coors Field, but the process of going from one to the other. They have to completely change their sights, their rest and recovery routines are changed home to road. It takes longer to recover at altitude. There's less oxygen in the blood. And then their pitches. I mean, some pitches work completely differently on the road at home. It's a total adjustment. So it's not necessarily pitching at altitude that causes the problem alone. It's the transfer from one to the other. And you'll see pretty often, like, even if there's a rest day in between a road trip and a homestand, or a homestand and a road trip, you'll often see pitchers who pitch the final game at a homestand at Coors Field not pitch the first game on the road to allow them to to throw and sort of acclimate themselves even to sea level, just to sort of regain their sights on their pitches. It's an issue that probably will never not be something that pitchers have to deal with at Coors Field or pitching for the Rockies, but they're figuring it out. The thing is, a lot of times, you'll hear the counter argument as, well, both teams have to pitch at Coors Field, and that's true. But if the Twins come to Denver for an interleague series, their pitchers only have to pitch 3 games there. The Rockies pitchers are pitching 81 games. What they need to do, or what they've kind of tried to do, is find an advantage of familiarity. They have to deal with it more often. They have to deal with the negatives more often than visiting teams. True, but they also know how to deal with it better than visiting teams, because they're more familiar with the changes. So they have begun to sort of embrace this idea more than shy away from it, I think, in recent seasons, which is encouraging for them.
Absolutely. You look at the Rockies opening day roster. On SB Nation, the Rockies community Purple Row page projects the Rockies opening roster. They project their starting rotation to consist of John Gray, Tyler Anderson, Chad Bettis, Herman Marquez, and Kyle Freeland. Does that seem to be about right based on what you've heard?
That does seem about right, although I would maybe put the order differently. The 5 of them is what I would guess. That would be my guess at the moment. Gray is definitely their number 1. Tyler Anderson was going to pitch if they'd won the wild card last year and didn't need to use him in the wild card game. He was going to pitch game 1 of the NLDS against the Dodgers, so he is likely their number 2, I think, going into this season. I think Herman Marquez is their number 3. He was a rookie last season. He was very good. He was the only rookie who essentially lasted through the end of last season. Sure. And then Bettis and Freeland at the back. Bettis being pretty important, because even though he's still 28, 29 years old, he is by far the veteran member of their staff. His presence, I think, in the rotation court pitching numbers, statistically, his presence is very important. So, yeah, and then Kyle Freeland has been pretty good in spring. He's not walking anybody, which they most certainly like among Rockies coaches. So yeah, basically Gray, Anderson, Marquez, Bettis, Freeland, I think is probably the rotation going into the season, if I had to guess right now.
2 obvious names that were left off of there, according to the Purple Row, is Jeff Hoffman and Antonio Senzatella. They say both of whom could easily claim spots in the rotation with a strong spring. What about those 2 guys' chances? Oh, it looks like we are having some technical difficulties. It looks like Nick may have lost connection as to where he was at. We'll try to get him back on the air here, but it looks like the call did drop. So, but we're going to continue on with this anyway. So it looks like the 2 obvious names left off were Jeff Hoffman and Antonio Senzatella. They have the 8 relief pitchers that Purple Row projects. Obviously, Wade Davis, Jake McGee, Brian Shaw, those are kind of givens. And then you also have Adam Ottavino, Mike Dunn, Chris Rusin, Scott Oberg, and Carlos Estevez. They're saying that Rusin, Dunn, and Ottavino, along with Davis, McGee, and Shaw, are pretty much penciled in unless something crazy happens. Oberg appeared to have earned Bud Black's trust over last season and should be a lock for the 7th spot. The spot that they have Carlos Estevez in is the spot that, according to them, it could get interesting in. They also have Zach Rosscup, who doesn't have any options, which might seem to give him a leg up, but he was a lefty specialist in the bullpen, and they have 3 other lefties in that bullpen, so that might hurt his chances, and given Estevez is the best reliever, so they're projecting that he gets the final spot. I thought it was interesting when Nick was saying about how they need to hit home runs. You look at this team, and they have Blackman and Mayhew and Story and Gonzalez and all these, they have power hitters, and it's kind of surprising as to how few home runs that they actually hit last year. I didn't think that he was going to come on and say that one of the Rockies' issues was needing to hit home runs. That's kind of an interesting dynamic that he had, or that he mentioned, because Coors Field, obviously I other than being a casual Rockies observer, even though I'm a diehard baseball fan, you would think that that Coors Field has always been known to have inflated numbers. I mean, Mike Hampton signed there. He had great years with the Mets and the Astros, and he goes there for 10 years and $100 million or 126 or something like that, and he has a terrible ending to his career. So, I was really surprised, and the ball carries there, obviously, because of the high altitude. Nick kind of mentioned it. The Rockies players have to adjust to that, and their pitchers and things like that. So I thought that was really, really interesting when he talked about that. Purple Row has the catchers as the starter is Chris Iannetta, and the backup is Tony Wolters. Recently signed, Iannetta easily takes the spot. Wolters wins the second spot because of his ability to left-right platoon with Iannetta, but watch out for Tom Murphy. His bat would provide considerably more punch to the lineup, and he has a lot to prove in spring training to get that spot. Obviously, infield is where they're very, very strong. They have Nolan Arenado, Trevor Story, and DJ LeMahieu, among others. They also have Ryan McMahon, etc. This is the easiest group of the groups to figure out, because unless the Rockies acquire another another first baseman before the season, the 5 infielders currently on the 40-man roster will be the 5 on the roster. Pat Valiaka's ability to back up every position allows the Rockies to carry the 8th reliever, which obviously, they need a lot of help in doing that. So it's one of those things where they can use a lot of help in the pitching department. So that was one of the big things. So Nick did get disconnected, and he did send me a message saying he has some other stuff he has to get to, so he will not be rejoining us, but I do thank him for his time. He was able to give us a good 15 minutes or so. The outfield situation for the Rockies is interesting. This is actually, the Purple Rose says that this is probably the hardest group to figure out due to a couple of tough players. If it was a matter of just picking the most talented outfielder of the bunch, it would be a lot easier, because Ramil Tapia would be on the roster. However, it's about development, contracts, playing time. As it is with any team, you're not going to bench a guy making $5 or $6 million for a rookie who's making $550,000 or whatever the league minimum is. Obviously, Charlie Blackmon is he's one of the top players in the game of baseball. He's locked into one spot. They list Charlie Blackmon, Ian Desmond, Dave Dahl, Gerardo Parra, and Mike Toshman as the 5 Rockies outfielders. Purple Rose says it really only leaves one starting outfield spot with Blackmon, Parra, and Desmond on the roster. Dahl or Tapia is going to make the roster, with the other one going to AAA to get more playing time. They're working under the assumption that goes to Dahl. Tapia could benefit from some additional time in AAA to work on his defense. So, it's going to be really interesting. And when Nick was on, he was talking about, he was talking about how that bullpen needs to be really, really good because of the fact that they play in probably the toughest division in baseball. You look at that NL West. Obviously, the LA Dodgers are the cream of the crop. You know, we don't need to go over their roster. Everybody knows who the Dodgers have: Seager, Bellinger, Kershaw, Puig, Turner. The list goes on and on. It's basically an all-star team. But then you look at a team like the Giants, who have made two really interesting pickups this offseason. They picked up Evan Longoria and his contract from the Tampa Bay Rays. He, obviously, third base. They had re-signed Pablo Sandoval last year. Don't know how that's going to work out, so I'm assuming that they're going to have Evan Longoria in there. You also look at, obviously, having Hunter Pence, and you have, like I said, the other one that they picked up was Andrew McCutchen to play, I'm assuming, probably center field or right field. So that team has a lot of offense as well. Brandon Belt, guys like that. So, and then you look at the D-backs. Obviously, Paul Goldschmidt is the face of that franchise. They have a lot of talent. That whole division is really, really, really tough, like Nick said. And people look at a team like the Padres, and the Padres may not look very strong on paper, but they actually have the number one farm system in all of baseball, according to ESPN's Keith Law and other outlets as well. So, you know, it's one of those things that, like Nick said, the Rockies are really kind of banking that the bullpen of McGee, Davis, and Shaw will be the strength of that team, and they're going to need it to be, because when they go, you know, when you have to play 76 games or whatever the case is, 90 games against your interdivision rivals, and you have all these teams with these, you know, Goldschmidts and Longorias and Turners and Puigs and McCutchens and all these players coming in, you need a strong bullpen and a great pitching staff to be able to handle that. And that's what I think the Rockies are shooting towards. But yeah, so the Rockies are 8-10 this year in spring training in Cactus League play. They are scheduled to play the Dodgers today, or I guess tonight. It's a night game. Right now, the leaders, the spring training leaders, Dave Dahl, obviously we mentioned him, and the Purple Row mentioned him. He's got 4 home runs and 13 RBIs this spring training, but he's only hitting .205. So low batting average, and you know, spring training matters. Spring training numbers obviously don't matter a whole lot. There's some numbers that matter for players. For certain players, it's more about just kind of stretching out and getting back to working a full 162-game season, or getting stretched out to work that. Dave Dahl is also their leader in runs batted in with 13 RBIs this spring training. So for a guy fighting for the for the 4th outfield spot, he's playing pretty well. Charlie Blackmon, obviously, won the batting title last year. He hit .331, just beat Daniel Murphy, who hit .322, and Justin Turner, who hit .322. Blackmon and Arenado both hit 37 home runs. They were way behind Giancarlo Stanton, but they still had a very, very good season. Arenado drove in 130 RBIs. So you're going to see a lot of numbers, unsurprisingly, for the Rockies offensively. And I think what Nick was getting at was that ownership and management have been trying to. They made the commitment to basically reconstruct the bullpen and reconstruct the pitching staff. He talked about, obviously, John Gray's their number one, and they need contributions from all five of those guys. So it's one of those things that, you play in that division, and you have to hope that, in that division you win, a third to half your games. If you can win half your games versus those teams in your division, you're doing pretty well. I mean, Greg Holland last year, he was their closer. He had 41 saves, and they didn't even bother re-signing him. They talked to him. They couldn't come to an agreement, and they moved on to Wade Davis. And as far as I know, Greg Holland, I believe, is still unsigned. Yeah, he is. Scott Boras is his agent. He says the closer is finding his clients new contracts. Boras tells John Morosi of MLB Network, quote, "We're closer to deals than we were 2 weeks ago. Some of these things are only a phone call away." He may not. So the spin on that, the hot take is Holland may not need as much time as a starting pitcher to get ready for the regular season, but it's getting late enough in spring training that his opening day availability might be in question even if he signs soon. So it's one of those things, like Nick talked about too. It's a weird market, and he mentioned that players are aware of it. And it'll be really interesting to see what plays out over the next year because, like he said, next year the two prize free agents are Manny Machado and Bryce Harper. Bryce Harper, some people are saying he's going to get a $400 to $500 million contract. That remains to be seen. We'll see if it can beat A-Rod's all-time single contract or Giancarlo Stanton's contract, but it's going to be interesting. You have to look at the Rockies, and like Nick said, they're a team that if things fall their way correctly, it's very possible that they could compete for a wild card spot. He mentioned a whole bunch of other teams that could as well. The one team that he threw in there that I thought was interesting was the Cardinals. The Cardinals have been consistently good, and a lot of that goes to Mike Matheny in the front office. That organization has just been really, really good, and they've turned out young players, and they have Alex Reyes and Luke Weaver and a lot of talent on that team. So for him to hear him say that they might be a wild card contender is very interesting. I mean, they play in probably one of the easier divisions. They really only have one team above them, and that's the Cubs. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. All right, I am going to wrap up this episode. I do apologize again. Nick did get cut off, and he got called into a few other phone calls that he had to take. So he was not able to come back and rejoin us. But we did get 15 minutes with Denver Post columnist Nick Groke, and we will see if we can maybe have him back on sometime after the season starts. Stay tuned. Got a couple more episodes today, including another edition of Collector's Corner, where I'm going to talk with the host of the podcast, Let Me Get That Potograph, as well as New York Times best-selling author and author of over 20 books on baseball, the Yankees, King Kelly, Thurman Munson, and many others. Nick, we are going to talk with the best-selling author Marty Apple. He is going to talk about his book that just came out regarding Casey Stengel. It just won the Casey Award. It's available in paperback next week. So we're going to talk about all that and more. Marty's going to give me an hour of his time tonight. It's going to be a fun conversation, so make sure you guys stick around for that. As always, this episode and every episode is dedicated to the memory of my dad. If you have the chance to donate to disabled veterans or any veterans organization, I ask that you please do so. Let's make sure that as we go through each day, we're living our lives positively, we're doing things to help others, to make others' lives easier. We're spreading love, joy, compassion, and laughter. Because after all, we all love baseball, but we could all stand to be a lot more kinder. Ladies and gentlemen, kindness is where it's at. Thank you very much for joining me on this episode of the show about the show.